The other day, I realized something tragic. I don't actually know how to draw cats. But Evie, you might say, didn't you want to illustrate a book with a cat main character? Haven't you drawn cats before? And didn't I see a cat in nearly every art vlog of yours? I have drawn cats in the past. Sometimes quick sketches, sometimes simplified cat characters for small projects. But if you ever sat down and tried to draw a bicycle from memory, only to suddenly not remember where which chain goes and how proportions of anything work, that's how it felt when I tried to sit down and draw the first illustration for my cat guide to Jeju Island. I don't have a distinct art style for cats, I don't draw them often enough, and without a reference, I'm pretty much lost. When I encounter a subject I struggle with, my first instinct is always this: go back to basics and draw some studies. Today our model is Hedwig, our slightly grumpy yet very affectionate 10-year-old cat. He's actually quite a terrible art model, moves as soon as I start sketching him, turns his head whenever I want to snap a picture. Most of my pictures of him are various sleeping poses or his back turned towards me. It was early in the morning, so I tried to warm up on top of learning more about cat shapes. Colored pencil sketches are great for warm-up exercises. I can't erase the lines, so I have to force myself to be decisive, and the small, continuous movements wake up my wrist and fingers. We all often joke that cats behave like liquids. And in a lot of my sketches for the cat guidebook, the little cats are just blobs with legs that can take on any shape. But what works at a small size for thumbnail sketches doesn't then easily translate to full-sized illustrations. Now, looking at a reference in which Hedwig is only partially lit by sunlight, emphasizing the shapes with distinct shadows, I start seeing that, while liquid, cats are also surprisingly angular. I tried to emphasize the plane changes of legs, back, neck and head by also changing the direction of my pencil shading, creating this little cat loaf here. A big hurdle for my cat guide illustrations is the art style. I personally love cute, stylized, minimalistic cat art of all kinds. And there's a lot of that to be found here in South Korea, at bookshops or at art fairs. Nearly every illustration and book fair has a whole plethora of cat illustrations, and I've collected my fair share of cat prints, postcards, keychains, even mouse pads. But I'm not sure if a simplified, stylized approach is what fits my own personal art style. I tend to go with very delicate art, leaning more towards realism. So one goal for these studies, beyond understanding what my cat actually looks like, is to figure out how far I can go into realism before I lose the expressions and stylization that help make a drawing of a cat turn into a cat character. I hope that distinction makes sense. Looking through my sketches here, you can see that while the storyboard and concept became more colorful over multiple iterations, at its core it's always been about beautiful, detailed nature scenes, and I don't want the cat character to look completely out of place in those. I kept going with these colored pencil sketches, using some of my usual favorite pencils in various earth tones. I quickly fell in love with using a uniform cool gray to emphasize the shadow shapes on his white fur. I found the few pictures of him actually looking towards the camera, but there's another thing to consider. Taking well-lit pictures of a cat means the pupils will most likely be quite narrow and change the expression. I need to find a few videos of him when he's playing, pupils blown wide with excitement. I started to draw some portrait close-ups and felt more confident with the shape of the cat head at different angles. This depends so much on the type of cat you're drawing, on the individual. There are so many subtle differences to capture. While I was happy with these warm-up sketches, I felt like I'd moved too far into details too quickly, and so brought out a medium perfect for big, distinct shapes. Alcohol markers. Specifically, I used these pastel-colored markers by Ohuhu as the shades layer beautifully and can then be drawn over with other media. I usually don't go for the chisel tip that much, but it's a great tool when you want to observe angles and block in shapes. It forces me to ignore details, while still giving me some flexibility to draw both thin lines and broad area-filling strokes. I mostly used the warm grey color to draw my quickest cat shapes ever. The lighting for this first one didn't create as much contrast. Afternoon sunlight, but dimmed by lowered blinds for a more subdued look. I still tried to find and emphasize the darker areas, the planes facing away from the window, and layered markers multiple times to create that hint of darkness. I wasn't kidding when I said that most of my pictures of Hedwig are of him sleeping, with his eyes closed or head turned away. It's like he has a sixth sense just for cameras. So here he is again, splayed out on our bed. Markers are great for these poses that I don't quite understand anatomically before I start drawing. I can carve out the legs, figure out the angle of the shoulder blades, how the head is tucked in, just by layering and adjusting angles. Sleeping, full body poses like this are also the perfect moment to look at some actual cat anatomy, especially since the hind leg is so nicely on display. Now, this is probably a good moment to bring up that when I went to art school to study scientific visualization, I did have a short module focused on veterinary illustration. Though honestly it was pretty bare bones, no pun intended, and mostly concerned with general guidelines rather than specific animals outside of their medicine context. But what we did do that actually helped me immensely with drawing animals was a semester of once weekly mornings at the Zurich Zoo. And I recently found my old sketchbook from that time, so let's take a quick look. If I remember correctly, this is a moleskin watercolor sketchbook. You can see how old it is and how humid weather and fading got to it over the years. For live drawing sessions with, more often than not, very agile animals, these were all about quickly laying down shapes and only later, often after the animal had already changed poses or just wandered off somewhere, add details or more color variation. This page full of little hens is a great example of that. Each individual sketch took maybe 30 seconds, 20 of which were spent just observing the animal. Birds in general are great for observing shapes instead of limbs, as they are easier to break down into abstract shapes. I also had a similarly simple page of mice later in the sketchbook. I remember really struggling with a lot of these during that module. I'd always been a bit hesitant when it comes to brush strokes and using too little paint in general, and often got feedback along those lines, that my sketches were blurry, where they should be sharp, indecisive, where they should be confident. To make things easier, I'd go look for sleeping animals. The red pandas here are some of my favorites. And then, much later, I found my perfect life drawing model, crocodiles and alligators. Yes, please just freeze there like that for the next 2 hours as I paint you. Thank you. I'd also try my hand at a variety of anatomically very complex animals, zebras, antelopes, constantly moving, and often just a small difference in limb length or neck posture can mess up the entire proportions completely. I do like how I layered the zebra stripes here though. I'd painted the shadow shapes of the actual animal first, exploring the dimensions of the neck and head, and only on a second pass layered the pattern above. That might be helpful to keep in mind for my little cat-tiger illustrations. Looking back, I've always loved painting from references, no matter if real-life ones or photographs, and finding that line between realism and abstraction. I hope I can bring both some of that softness and also some more confidence that I grew over the years to my newer sketches. The last alcohol marker sketch was another close-up. In my mind, my cat's face is very round and his eyes are huge, probably because I always get in real close to look at him. It's interesting to observe the actual proportions and to see how little space the eyes of him dozing here actually take up. I'd mentioned that these markers are great for layering with other media. Here I went over them with colored pencils. The alcohol marker layers are completely smooth as the pigments sink into the paper, in comparison to something like acrylic, squash or acrylic markers. And so the colored pencils have no issue at all building up and layering smoothly on top. This second pass gives me a chance to look at the fur pattern and details of the cat, while the marker layers were all about the overall shape. So it's like a step-by-step approach in which we compartmentalize different parts of the drawing to make the process easier. These sketches helped me understand the overall anatomy better, as well as seeing some of the planes more clearly, how the top of the head angles down into the nose, how the ears perk up, and how the legs fold. I wrapped up my alcohol marker sketches, had lunch, ran errands, and then used the rest of that cloudy afternoon to dive into watercolors. After all, that's what the cat guidebook is going to be painted in. I think the marker and colored pencil sketches were incredibly helpful though. Going directly into watercolors for a subject I want to not only draw, but understand, can be much more difficult, as I'll also have to focus on color mixing, creating interesting patterns, and watercolors are so delicate that it can be difficult to lay down decisive shape layers. I'm glad I was already in a cat state of mind by the time I brought them out. I started with another head study, as this was now all about finding a closer match for the art style that I had vaguely imagined. Like I mentioned earlier, I don't want to go stylized or minimalist. There are so many amazing artists out there with distinct styles for their animal characters, honed over years and years of drawing consistently in that style. And my own focus is more on how to create a semi-realistic look that harmonizes and plays up my own strengths and interests as an artist. I really like how this sleepy little cat pose turned out. Here Hedwig actually fell asleep on a package full of my art scenes delivered from the printing company, and I remember just taking this picture of him and waiting for later in the day to actually open the package. He has a pretty distinct head shape. Again, every cat is an individual. I love emphasizing the little brown spot on the side of his nose, the fainter one on his mouth, and all the stripe patterns framing his face. Here I'm certainly in my comfort zone. It's where I'm happiest. Building up layers, going slow, finding subtle color shifts and textures in my watercolors. I recently finished my updated watercolor palette, and here the Aussie Red Gold by Daniel Smith did a lot of the heavy lifting, as it's such a vibrant orange, perfect to bring the fur patterns to life. I also used the Piemontite Genuine a lot for more granulating, reddish-brown areas, and then mixed in Bloodstone Genuine for the deepest shadows. A hint of the Rhodonite Genuine, kind of a magenta color, was perfect to emphasize the subsurface scattering happening on the ears. I drew smaller versions of the same head next to it, but tried to simplify shapes and to leave out individual elements, the mouth shape for example, and changing the proportions around just a bit. This is why I always go back to studies when I'm unsure about my destination. It's so much easier to draw a realistic study first and then use that as the base and reference for style experiments, instead of using the photo reference directly. That one step of removal both gives me time to familiarize myself with a shape or pose and gives me more freedom to leave the photo reference behind. How do you tackle a new subject or the return to something you haven't drawn in a long time? I know that not everyone can just decide that they'll spend their day off sketching cats and then editing a video about sketching cats, but I believe that for me personally, this one extra step saves me so much time and frustration down the line. The differences are quite subtle here. One head a bit rounder and tapering down in a triangle shape, while the other imitates life more closely. I also emphasized the eyes more in the second sketch and was more aggressive with the stripe pattern. I really like the direction here. If you've ever drawn characters with closed eyes instead of with open eyes, you know what a difference those make. So, of course, another study. Here I finally felt like I got the hang of the frontal look, how to show the three-dimensionality of the nose, the shadows cast, the twisting back of the ears, but most of all, after much trial and error, I found a more angular shape of the eyes that I'm really happy with and that I think really captures the look of our cat. He's a bit funky looking sometimes, a bit grumpy, a bit of a little gremlin, but also the most beautiful creature on earth in my eyes. I want to make sure that my little cat character isn't just cute, but keeps some of those characteristics. I think the angular eye shape instead of a softer, larger, round shape will make a big difference, and for my miniature versions I tried to mirror that with more angular brush strokes overall and the head shape in particular. A surprise color that I kept reaching for was the lavender. As a complementary shade to these yellow-orange and brown tones, it shimmered beautifully when used as a shadow. Similarly to the cool grey colored pencil I'd used earlier for the warm-up sketches, it's such a delicate color that doesn't overpower the image but brings contrast all the same. I've now started drawing the first illustration for my cat guidebook, a proof of concept, so to speak, in which I use these sketches as references and guides to bring my idea to life. It's more urgent than I thought at first, as I just got accepted to a small local book fair, which takes place in the first week of April. And while I applied with just my Dracula art scene and some single Jeju-themed prints, I want to have the first illustration sample ready by mid-March, so that I can make prints and maybe even some cute cat stickers for that book fair, as well as the Patreon snail mail membership. Thank you so much to everyone who signed up last month. Shipping all the little letters brought me so much joy, and I'm incredibly grateful for your support. You can see how it took me a while to get the look I wanted at first, and I kept erasing my sketch with a kneaded eraser. At one point, the eyes being too large and round made him look like a Ghibli character. I think focusing on angles will also contrast the character nicely with the environment, which will be softer for the most part. And I think it balances with my delicate watercolor approach. I'm really happy with this little guy here. What do you think? Can you see the evolution throughout these sketches and the honing in on a direction? Is there one that stands out to you in particular? I'd love to hear about your study and sketching process, and if you use specific art supplies to practice different things, like I did here. If you'd like to see more animal paintings, both from long ago and more recent, I'd love to do more of them, no matter if cats, birds, crocodiles, or something completely different. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in my next art video.